Our guest is none other than Professor Mthuli Ncube, who, like I said, is an ex. But ex fundamentally being the former head of the school himself. Thank you so much, Mr. Ncube, for your time. We really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, without wasting much of your time, please welcome Professor Mthuli Ncube.
One thing that has been bothering me is whether South Africa can improve its growth rate. Number two, whether Africa can maintain its average growth rate of 5%. Can South Africa and the rest of Africa withstand more shocks from the global economy? It seems to be under control for a while, but clearly Europe is under pressure. And while we're getting used to a stabilizing Greece, and then there's Brexit. You know, I'm living in a country where Brexit is the issue now. Will the UK leave the European zone? And then what's going to be the impact of that? So there's a lot going on globally that is impacting on South Africa. Whenever the index of fear in the US is rising, basically something happens in South Africa as well. Often fear, increased fear in the US is followed by a rand that appreciates. Very interesting. And the way it works is that capital leaves the US, and the US here is a proxy for developed markets, by the way, but that's what happens into our markets through various channels, either in terms of foreign direct investment, which is much more long-term with a lower risk of reversal, or is short-term hot money portfolio flows into the equity market or bond market with the risk of withdrawal. So the fear factor has an impact on the rand. The G7 economies, which are the largest in the world, top 7, it tends to lead South Africa's growth by a quarter. So you know that if the US economic slow down or slow down in the OECD countries in Europe, that eventually will be felt here through a variety of channels. One of them is trade, for instance. It could even be tourism, but there's so many channels, and I'm going to explore with you where those channels, how those channels work. That's what the data is telling me, that we should be more concerned about a slowdown in the US, in the UK, and in Italy, mostly, these three, more than Germany or Russia. The UK economy was the biggest contributor. Italy, you know, drags you down all the way, but the UK was the biggest contributor to the SA crisis in 2009, right? Of course, with domestic shock drivers, maybe it's the politics, who knows? It's all manner of things, how we manage the economy is yet another issue that we should be concerned about. It is the domestic policies that have been dragging down, slowing down South Africa's economic growth more than global factors. I also did some additional work to check whether when these global shocks, be they from Italy, from the US, from the UK, or China, I'll come to China in a moment, do they also act through a third channel? Because what could be happening is that UK shocks are transmitted to Italy, for example, and then Italy to South Africa. So there's a third and indirect channel at play, and lo and behold, there is. How are these shocks really being transmitted into the economy? Is it through a third country, or is it through any of these other factors that I've listed? The shocks into South Africa from the rest of the world are being transmitted through trade. The fact that if they grow at a slower rate, we can only export less because there'll be less demand from the US or wherever. It's also through the bond markets because of the core movement that I've already explained, that the moment the yields drop in the US, chances are they will drop over here too. And again, there's some intermediary transmission mechanisms to explain those two. It could be through the JSE, how the Aussie, all-share index moves relative to the S&P 500 or any of the European indices. It's also got to do with the core movement in exchange rate. That's also a factor. Business confidence is also very important, and business confidence is also driven by largely by domestic factors. How about China, Brazil, and India and Russia? Do any shocks from those economies impact South Africa? They do. They do. and the biggest source of shocks is China. I put all that in, and this is what the financial stress index of South Africa looks like. You can see from 1999 all the way to about present, fluctuating about. You can see the huge spike in about this period, which was the height of the crisis. Huge spike in the stress in the financial system. So three things. So monetary policy should care about the output gap, the inflation gap, and the stress levels in the financial sector. So in my view, there's a good argument to change the way monetary policy works, to take into account the financial stress due to these global spillovers, in addition to the output target in terms of the output gap and the inflation target in the way we think of those bands of 3 to 6%. I think that there's still a strong case to keep easy monetary policy. I think it's quite easy to get to the argument that, oh, a weak rand, which has been weakening, as you know, we needn't remind you of that, the response should be an increase in interest rates. I think because of rising inflation, we know where it's headed and it is going up, but then growth is slowing down. But the problem is that when growth slows down quite sharply, it cannot be the type of growth that attracts foreign direct investment or capital. On the contrary, weak growth can lead to an even weaker rand. There is a way in which I think monetary policy ought to respond to these shocks, and building in some of these financial variables through what I call the financial stress index is one way to do it. I think, and once you do that, you realize that a monetary policy has to be accommodative if it needs to deal with the shocks as they emerge. One key area is infrastructure. South African companies know how to do infrastructure, be it roads, be it electricity, whatever. There is enough technical skill and skill endowment to be able to handle any large infrastructure project in the rest of Africa. Which leads me into this junk status that we're all worried about. I'm worried about that. I spend a lot of time interacting with the Moody's team. Of course, they never tell me which countries are headed which way. But I can tell you which countries, in my view, are likely to have an upgrade going. In fact, one country that could have an upgrade going forward from any of the rating agencies, and it's Ethiopia. Absolutely. I can tell you that. But things are not looking great for South Africa right now on the political, if you take into account political risk issues. Number two, the growth prospects. South Africa slowing down is not very good for the credit rating. And these things fit into each other, because once there's a further downgrading, then it means that there's a less, as I say, less FDI, less portfolio flows. It will hurt the country, and it increases the cost of borrowing, because bond yields then will start going up both domestically and internationally, and that's not a nice spiral or vortex to be involved in. So ideally what you would like is the incidence of your growth. It is where the growth impacts the most, to be in the areas such as agriculture. That's where you want to impact the most. But that has not been the case. So growth is somewhere else. So it's been jobless growth. And the question is, how can these African countries transform? Because what you saw in Asia, if you look at South Korea, China, Japan, which is where it all started, in fact, if you think about that kind of model, countries, the structural transformation was always from agriculture and making use of that surplus in agriculture to finance a manufacturing sector. And then the manufacturing sector, that's why we're buying so many goods, manufactured goods from Asia, because that became the second stage. Then the third stage became services sector. So agriculture, manufacturing, services, that was the nature of the transformation. But what has happened in some African countries, they've moved from agriculture, which is also still badly run, badly managed, into services. And they've skipped the manufacturing sector. So the big conundrum for Africa is how to deal with manufacturing, because that's where you're going to create jobs, and how to improve productivity in agriculture.